And then now we are going to move into a new innovative session for this PRE-IALIPA workshop. And here we have some senior researchers who are reporting back to questions that were asked to the participants of this meeting, and they sent in some anonymous responses for this workshop session. And with these senior researchers, we have with us Keely from the BGS, the British Geological Survey, whose scientific research focuses on the impact of people and long-term changes in the hydroclimate on freshwater quality and quantity in low-altitude lake systems. Her work at the BGS currently is, she's involved in leading many professional aspects of science, including leading in equality, diversity, and inclusion program, and research ethics at the BGS, acting as an editor for Climate of the Past, and supporting the scientific community with roles on the councils of the International Society for Datum Research and Past Global Changes as well. We have Esteban Balseiro. Sorry, apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but he's a CONICET researcher at Comahue University. He's the director of INIBIOMA. Hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that. And his research interests are in limnology, climate change, species interaction, ecological stoichiometry, food web, and planktons. And we also have Beatriz Modennutti, who is also in INIBIOMA, and she's a CONICET researcher as well. She's a professor at the Universidad Nacional de Comahue, and her research interests are in limnology, climate change, human impact, microbial loop. So we will have the senior researchers give us feedback to some of the questions, the answers that we provided in terms of common funding and some interview questions. So welcome to our esteemed panelists. I think I've seen Keely here. I can see Esteban's on, and we have Beatriz. So please go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll start by sharing the screen, and we've got a few slides to share with everybody that just contain some of our reflections, and I'll start off and then hand over to Esteban and then Beatriz. And then really for the majority of the session, we'd like to answer questions from the audience. This is your turn, your time to ask us and draw on our experience that we have. So I will just share my screen with you now. So prior to this session, you were all the early career researchers were invited to submit around 100 words that outlined your strengths as a researcher, and you were asked to provide this to think about selling yourself for a grant proposal. So what we want to say first and foremost is thank you to those who submitted their examples. It was really interesting to read everybody's take on themselves. And we also just wanted to acknowledge that Beatriz, Esteban and I met last week to go through those 100 words. And we kind of acknowledge that it's a really hard thing to do, partly because 100 words is not a lot in which to sell yourself. But actually, it doesn't get any easier. The more senior you get, it doesn't get any easier to write about yourself. It's not something that comes naturally, I think, to most people, especially not to scientists. One of the other things that was quite difficult in 100 words was striking the balance between what statements you might make and what evidence that you were presenting to the people who were reading it. Probably a big one is sticking to the question. We asked, the question asked you to tell us about you, and lots of us told us how wonderful your research was, but forgot to mention how wonderful you were yourself as a scientist. And like I've said, selling yourself feels really strange. It doesn't matter where you are in your career. It's not an easy thing to do. It's actually a really challenging 100 words or 300 words to write about yourself. So we just wanted to reflect on your words, just, give you some examples of some really good phrases and why we thought these phrases were really strong. So there was one example that included, my contributions to the fields of paleoenvironmental research have been recognised internationally as I'm regularly asked to review for journals such as. And this was a really nice statement because it had the balance of saying something and providing the evidence. You could even, once you're further through, you might even say how many reviews. I review, 4 times, 5 times a year for this particular research journal. But it was a really nice balance of statement and evidence. And then another one, I have gained lots of experience in fieldwork and logistics in diversified operational contexts in remote regions. And again, another good example, the only change that you might want to make is to be specific, just quantify that statement of lots. I've got 5 years of experience. I've led 5 field campaigns, just so people can kind of gauge where you are with that experience. And then why did we ask for 100 words? One, we didn't want you all to write an essay actually prior to this session, but it's a really useful summary for CV. It's a way of selling yourself and putting that up front when you produce your CV. And you might also use social media platforms and things like LinkedIn, where that 100 word summary is really, really useful to include. The 100 word process, or whether it's 300 words, is a way to think about you and not your research, what you bring to your science as a researcher and all of that experience that you carry with you. And it's what some people would call your elevator pitch. If you were stuck in a lift with the head of research funding and you want to tell them why they should fund you, it's your ability to sell yourself and your skills in 1 minute. And this is also really important when it comes to interviews. Lots and lots of interviews will have what they would call an icebreaker question, where they want you to warm up before you start the formal part of the interview. And often that comes down to, tell us about yourself, tell us about what you do. So it's really important if you can have that solidified in your mind, it's really helpful in those instances. And actually those 100 words, you will always need to continually work on them, not just because your skills change through time, but you get more experience at understanding both your science and you. And it's easier to reflect as you get older or you get more senior further through your career. But I'll pass over to Esteban to pick up on the slides.
Thank you, Keely, and please go on with the slides as you have the control.
Are you sure? All right then.
So one thing is to be positive. You don't need to say, although I am very young, or despite. There were two of these statements that began with despite. This is not a good way to start. You need to put your best things in front and not be sorry of being young. That will go with the time. And also you don't need to say because we have little funds. Funds are things that are very limiting to all of us, all over the world. Nobody has infinite funds for research, so you always have to make some balance with the funds. But one thing is that how good are you getting funds? So if you start saying, because I don't have funds, may be interpreted as you are not good getting funds. So that's not what people want to hear from you. So these things that are not positive, don't put it. Put positive things about you. Also, people want to hear about how you work with other people. Are you good in that sense? So you must be positive in that sense. something that is very important is that you can ask colleagues, mentors, supervisors. People have different views from us than we have of ourselves, and they can sometimes they disagree with us in a good manner, and sometimes not, but sometimes they can see things that you don't realize, and maybe this is a very positive things to put in these statements. So you must ask them and give them this 100 words and say, okay, this is what I wrote about me, and listen to them. So these things are very important in how what to put. The next, please, Keely. Okay. Another thing important is that you must be conscious of where are you applying. It's not the same what are you going to highlight depending if you are applying to a fellowship or a position, because this implies not only your work abilities, but your capacity of working within groups. If I'm applying for a fellowship in Keely's group, I want to know Keely that I am a good involving in the group, and not a person that cannot work with other people because she won't like it. If she will give me a fellowship, she will like me to be a person that I will get within the group and work friendly and how do you say, very enthusiastic within the group, not only for my only benefit, but for the group benefit. If you are applying for a position, you must highlight how are you as a leader, because if you have a position, you must lead a group, and your ability to obtain funds, because if you have a position or a fellowship, a postdoc fellowship, it's good to if you can get funds for support your research. So these are things that are very important for in this sense. If you are going for a short stay for to a lab for a training, your ability as a leader or your ability for obtaining funds are not so important, but your capacity of working within the group, how this training will improve your future work. When you are applying for a training or for a course, is very important to say how this training or how this course will improve your future work, because these are short things, and the important things is what I will gain with this training or with this course. So be conscious, where are you applying to? I don't think there's another one, Keely?
No, that's all of our slides.
So I think we can hear. No, say, I don't know if Beatriz wants to add something.
No, I think that you say the most important thing about courses, because it's very, very important to be specific in that point. If you present a letter for a course that for example, I am interested, and you fill the exact title of the course, this letter would be very bad for the purpose. And it's important to be specific how this course would improve your experience or your future work.
Okay, I think thank you for the exercise. I think for those people who did not get to do the 100 words exercise, this is a challenge to you. How can you market yourself in 100 words after hearing all these tips, so that the next time we meet you on social media, we're like, wow, these people are shining here. So I think we will open this to a more interactive session with regards to this scholarship funding activity and funding activity, in terms of trying to sell yourself to different potential calls. And as ECRs, we are always looking for the next call here or there to get a position here or there, to get some money to do some different kind of research. So I think because there are no questions on the chat, feel free to use the raise your hand button, and you can unmute yourself to ask the questions. So welcome to the Q&A session for this.
I was going to say, if you're one way to start thinking about yourself would be to write down words that you think describe you, you know, and your skills. But the other thing that I think is really important as well, if you think about applying for courses or places to upskill yourself, is what's missing. So I think picking a little bit up on Beatrice's point that, you know, I'm interested in the whole thing. You know, that's not quite true. You'll know where you are missing a specific skill, and it's okay to say that. You don't have to be interested in everything. And the person reviewing that won't be looking for that necessarily either. They'll be looking for, you know, you've thought about what aspect of that training course or that lab placement will build those skills, and how you almost envisage seeing those skills add to your portfolio of work and to your CV, and how they would be integrated. So never feel that when there's a call out that you have to pretend to be interested in everything, because you don't. You can say why certain aspects of the course will suit and work for you.
Okay, just perhaps to start on a little bit of the Q&A session, I'm quite curious, for those who are at the tail end of their PhDs, everybody is always looking for a postdoc position, but on the other hand, there are opportunities to start up your own postdoc project that may be hosted by a university, and it would be relatively very competitive. And looking at positions like postdocs, which are a little bit farther after your PhD, how would somebody approach selling themselves to such positions?
I'd like to say that these are really good places in which to do that, to have those informal conversations. I think it is quite hard actually to send that first email to somebody that you've never met or you don't have any previous contact with, to try and outline who you are. I think if you're going to send an email to somebody who you've never met before or never had any interactions with, that you maybe think about the way you introduce yourself. You know, I want a postdoc in your lab is probably not going to get a response from me. However, talking about where you're interested and how your interest overlaps with, you know, perhaps my work or the work of the organization that I'm in is a really good way to get the conversation going. You know, it's really about starting that conversation, because in a lot of these fellowships where you might be required to find a university host, it needs to be developed in conversation, partly because you want to be able to fit into that organization as well. You don't want to be one person that's different to the rest of the group. So, you know, try and start a conversation, but certainly at networks like this, where you get to meet people through the activities of other ECR networks. Obviously, conferences in person are always nice, but there's plenty of opportunities in these virtual settings to chat and engage with others. I'm not sure if somebody else wants to add.
Yes, I agree with you, Keely. And one thing I think is that in this email, Yeah, this hypothetical email. One thing important is to show to whom you are writing to that you know what they are doing in that lab and why you want to go to that lab to join this work, because what have you done and what do you think you may add to that lab, another view or another skill for you or something like that. But it is important to show that you are very conscious on what is that lab doing and how this joining this lab you will improve. I have several times received this kind of emails, and you realize that okay, they have my name, but they don't know really what are in the by now, so they don't know what my group have published in the last 2 years or something like that. They don't know what you don't need to know what I am doing just now, because that's unpublished. But what I have published in the last few years is very important, because maybe I have done something interesting 10 years ago, but I'm not in the same road now. So it's important to know that kind of things when you write for a postdoc, for example.
And I mean, just thinking back to the networks as well, it doesn't have to be your network. Can you use somebody else's network? Does your supervisor know the person that you want to apply for, or is a friend of yours, does their supervisor work in the area that you'd like to work to, and try and do it? You can do it more informally as well. It doesn't have to, feels a bit odd sending an email to somebody. It can be really difficult to write. So if there are informal ways of going to those, of kind of using those networks that exist, or perhaps by some spot of luck, the person you'd like to work with is giving an online seminar. You know, you can go to the seminar, you can ask them a question, and you don't have to ask them, you can type it in the chat if it's a little bit scary to ask the question, and then you can always use that as a follow-up. So I saw your talk and I asked this question, I just wondered. And like I say, it's trying to get really that dialogue going, so that it's kind of an inclusive conversation between the two. And, you know, that will allow a relationship to develop, because that's what you're wanting. You don't just want to go to a lab and just be working somewhere for someone. You kind of want to build that working relationship.
Okay, I can see there's a question in the chat. Sometimes it feels like when we are writing, I'm afraid of looking too much conceited. How do you balance this feeling, and how we are sure not to sound like that? So basically, how can we make ourselves shine and not?
Well, I think it's really hard to write those words and not feel like you're being a little bit conceited. I think they call it imposter syndrome in, you know, when you read about it. And I don't think you'll ever get over that. It's just learning to kind of breathe and deal with it. But I think this balance of not wanting to come across, if you're like, it's really in the language, and coming back to some of that evidence that you use, well, I'm just brilliant at what I do, I'm a fantastic diatom researcher, then you would sound quite conceited. But, you know, I'm really good at what I do. I've had some funding, I've published some papers, I work in a broader network, I've had lots of opportunities to work overseas with different types of people. I think it's bringing in some of that evidence, so it's not just these grand statements, it's just providing some additional support. But I'd love to tell whoever asked that question that, you know, I write my 100 words and I'm just like, oh my goodness, what do I sound like? but it's not something that comes natural. It's just something you almost learn to deal with. And that's why having somebody else to sense check it as well. How does this sound to you? Do I sound like I'm trying to oversell myself? I don't think you really can oversell yourself. I think it's just making sure that right evidence is just in there, and it doesn't have to be loads of evidence. It could be one paper or one review. You know, if you're early in your career, nobody is expecting you to have published 25 papers and had £1 million worth of funding. So don't worry about the numbers being low. That's fine. It's just evidence to show people that you are able to do what you're claiming you can do.
Another thing is that this kind of letters changes among countries, among the people. So it isn't the same if I am from Argentina and I speak of myself, or if I am from US and speak of myself, or I'm from Europe. So if I am writing from Argentina to somebody of Europe, it's good to ask somebody from Europe to read that letter. So it maybe it doesn't sound for me to be very considered, but maybe it sounds not good for a European or something like that. Maybe it sounds for me to be very good speaking about me, and somebody of US say, okay, this is a very shy person because he doesn't make a very good presentation. So it's important to ask somebody else from the other side, from Europe or United States or Latin America or Japan. Things are not the same in each region of the world. That's also an important thing.
Yes, Esteban, and also language is not the same.
No,
we need to write in English, and for instance, in Spanish, some sentences are really conceited for us, but in English, no. Therefore, it's important what you say, that that people from another side, for instance, Europe, US, etc., read that letter. This is very, very important, because normally in Spanish we don't use I am very experienced. I have experience very in that matter, or things like that. In Spanish, this sounds really bad.
Okay, as you could continue with the Q&A, I think we have some 10 more minutes to go. So feel free to use the raise your hand button. But while we're still at that, I'm quite curious. Maybe this would be addressed more to you, Keely, because you moved from your research interests to working in equality, diversity, and inclusion programs. And these are important as well in research. And sometimes you would find you have noticed a gap in a certain part of research that is not specifically very scientific, but is important to the work you do. And yet you do not have experience in that. So how do you sell yourself in that?
Well, I mean, I think it's a little easier in equality, diversity, and inclusion because I have my experience. And I think really that's how I got into it. It was more what I'd experienced through my career. And I used that as the baseline. And then from there, I worked with other people who had different experiences to me. And as you would in scientific research, I read a lot. I looked at lots of data and lots of numbers. I guess I didn't really treat it much differently to starting a new project. But the baseline was I had some experience, not all of it, but some of it. And it was something that I'm really, really interested and really passionate in. So it kind of enabled a little, it was a little easier to start engaging with what has been written. And also, as you can see, I talk a lot as well. I like talking to people and with people. So, being able to learn from others, I really enjoy from that ED&I aspect. And actually, it's probably these issues, like learning from others and talking with others, because we received 100 words from 7 or 8 different people, and the questions are asked, I feel a little conceited and I'm worried about overselling myself. You won't be the only person that feels like that. And actually there's some solidarity in talking with your colleagues and perhaps working together actually to have some support whilst you're writing these CVs or 100 words or grant funding. So I kind of dipped between 2 topics there. But no, I don't profess to be an expert in inequality, diversity and inclusion, partly because I don't have any qualifications in it. I think having the qualifications over time has made me feel much more confident about my ability. But I would say even after getting my doctorate, it took me about 12 months until I could cope with somebody referring to me as Dr. Mills. I found it hugely embarrassing for a long, long time afterwards, whereas now I'm really proud of the fact that I've got a doctorate and and I'm a doctor, but it took a long time.
Okay, I can see there's a question in the chat. So we have 2. We have one from Madeline, from Maddie, and she says, what would be the best way to describe gaps or breaks in your CV or research experience?
Okay, maybe if you have gaps or breaks, depending on the reason you have these gaps or breaks. But if you have a gap because you are a woman and have children, you only need to mention that that gap is because you had a child. This is not a bad thing. Maybe you had a gap because you decided to get away from research for a time, and you can explain it. Gaps normally exist, and you must be conscious on why you have this gap, and if this gap is important, you must explain it. You need to be conscious of on that. You don't need to be how to say I don't know the word, sorry. But you can only tell why.
I was going to pick up, I would be less, as I've got, maybe it's a privilege actually, as you get older, to worry less about the gaps in your CVs, but certainly if it's maternity or health related, I would be placing that as a, this gap is health or maternity related. But if it's been a gap because I've gone to work somewhere else, I would be sitting and thinking about everything that I learned in my other position or in my other job, or actually having had a break, what that's allowed me to reflect on and bring back. Because I would almost argue that having now 2 children at home, I've learned more about logistics first thing in the morning than I ever have in years and years of field work. So, there's lots of positives from having those different experiences. And I think it's trying to look at what you get from those experiences. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the scientific skill. It can just be ways of doing other other aspects of science, whether it's managing, whether it's leadership or responsibility. So there's very little, I think, that you would do in life where you can't show kind of a positive or what you've learned during that gap. And I think that it's worth, if it's a big gap, it's worth probably having a note to explain what that gap is and how it's been beneficial to you. As a scientist, as a person.
Okay, we have 2 questions. One's from the chat, and then we'll go to Nacho, who's raised his hand. So on the chat, you have Daniela, who says, in your experiences, what do you think makes one's career scientifically richer? To start a postdoc position from an already funded project, or to write your own and first grant for your postdoc?
Well, I would say
this is a really, really difficult question.
Well, I would say neither leads to a richer career, because defining a career richness is really about you as a person and how you view your success, not how somebody else views your success. Because I think if somebody from the outside was to look at my career path, they might not describe it as a rich scientific career path, but for me, it's been a very rich career path. I think there are bonuses of both, really. There's a bonus of working with somebody who you can learn more from, and you have that experience of working in their teams and their networks with a project that's in place. So all those skills that you get from developing your own grant funding. But I think there's risks and rewards basically for both, but I wouldn't say that one, well, I know, of course, I'm talking from a completely UK perspective here as well. There's not one pathway that's richer. There is, of which there will be richness in both. It's just seeing what that richness is, I think, for you.
Yeah, perhaps I use it richer as a complicated adjective, because I don't know. That's why I put it like in commas. Actually, it's like, I don't know how to describe it, like what will be like best for your own development as a researcher now, because like writing a grant for a postdoc, it will take time. So you need time to figure out how to do it if you have never done it. So it can take more than 6 months. But then if you have this break that we were talking about, breaks, then yeah, you can justify it, but at the same time, you're like kind of losing some other experiences that you could be already training in a new postdoc. So yeah, I have come with this question with different colleagues as well, because nowadays I think it's easier to apply, or it has been always easier to apply for a postdoc position, but both of them are highly competitive. So a postdoc and a grant, and writing a grant. So, well, that's my question. Thank you for answering me.
And I mean, I think that there is a broader issue, isn't there? The competition is high everywhere. I mean, I don't like to set the bar too low, but really for me, getting an interview anywhere means I'm doing really well because it's so hard to sometimes pick that post. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's an answer, and I know this is really hard, and something I still grapple with now is thinking, where do I want to be in 5 years' time? Where do I want to be in 10 years' time? And it's really hard when you're looking for jobs to try and think like that, because actually 6 months in a 10-year plan is a very short period of time. But because we're always living the here and now, it seems like the biggest blip in your career, but it's always trying to keep your mind on that long goal and actually invest in time in yourself, you know, whether it's writing those 100 words, you know, or the words that represent you, is sitting down and thinking, right, well, what works for me? What works for me and how I see myself maturing over that period of time, and also my career, because there's both to balance, because you'll never just be a scientist all of your life either. You will always be a human first and a scientist second. So it's, you know, that balance of what works for you. And that's not the answer that you want, but I don't think there's an answer for it, other than it's taking that time to invest in yourself and think about you, and realizing that any blip, paper rejection, grant rejection, it's one blip in a curve that looks like this over 10, 15, 20, 50 years. You know, it can be a very short setback, even though it doesn't feel like it at the time, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we can move over to Nacho, and then we have one last question in the chat. So if you'll allow us to extend this by another 5 minutes, because we're getting quite a lot from it, please indulge us. Nacho, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. So yeah, first, I really appreciate this event. So you don't find this type of open conversation so often. So this is great. It's wonderful. And my question has to be with outreach. activities in general. So I think we are now starting to appreciate how important is the way that we communicate our science, that we connect with the general public. So my question would be, how important do you think it is to be explicit about not only how many papers we have published, but also how we communicate on all the outreach activities and groups that we'll be participating in our applications, for instance, for a postdoc? Do you think this is relevant? Do you think this is, or his relevance is growing? And do you, suggest us to include this sort of information? So thank you.
Yes, I think it is. The number of papers, anybody can look how many papers you have in the internet or in your CV or Web of Science, Scopus or Google Scholar or something like that. It's easy to know how many papers you have published. It's not easy to know how are you in this other aspects. And I think these interviews or these presentations need to highlight how you are in these other aspects that are not so easy to get it from the internet. But the number of publications is very easy to get it from the internet. I can search now and get the number of papers of almost anybody. But I don't know how they are working daily, sharing equipments or sharing data or sharing ideas or things like that. And I think these presentations should go to these points much more than how many papers I had, because any kind of these letters will be accompanied by a CV. So you can, or you have internet and you can, okay, I want to know how many papers have published Nacho. I can do it in a few minutes. Much easier than open a CV, probably. And now internet, it's terrible in that way, but terrible in a good manner. But I think these things, how are you communicating? How are you working daily? How are you after work, including after work? Are you a person that you can go for a beer after work or something like that, or not? It's part of all this living, and I think it's part of everything, and it's not in your CV or not in your in the internet. And you must go to these points that I cannot go to internet and know about you.
In terms of your CV, it's almost tying it up in the what's the impact of my work. We often do this communication, don't we, to try and drive impact and understanding of our work. So it's almost tied, when you look at the impact of the science, you've got the papers, which is your academic, your academic impact from a science point of view. And then you've got, and I helped organize an ECR workshop globally, which enabled networking and the skills that come from that. So, there will be skills that you get from the communication aspect that might not be so, or from the public engagement aspect that might not be so available in perhaps the job that you're doing or the role that you're in. So you gain that extra expertise. But it's always a careful balance. And again, it's thinking about how it fits for you. You shouldn't ever have to feel like you have to do all these publishing, all these reports, all these funding, all this outreach. Find the balance that works for you. But it's impact. I mean, it's part and parcel of science. And I think selling it as that impact. I encouraged 200 children to look at a diatom down a microscope probably only 5 will ever look at a diatom down a microscope, but I tried, you know. But there's something around, and actually, you know, actually coming back almost full circle again to writing those 100 words. The more you talk and engage with different people, allows you to think differently about those 100 words and what the audience is and who you're selling that 100 words to, which comes back to grant applications again. You know, most people reviewing grants will not be a field specific expert. It will be a broad pool of reviewers that have got some idea about environmental sciences, but maybe not the diatoms. Spoken to your gran about the work that you do and getting your gran to understand it will be appreciated by the reviewers, who then aren't lost in the technical terms, because lots of grants fall down, not because of the quality of the science. Very, very rarely, it's because the wording's so impenetrable, people can't get through or understand what's been going on. So there's lots that you can get lots of experience from that engagement. I think that helps your science gain traction in other areas such as funding.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll go to our last question of the session from Ramina, who says, thanks for the talk. I got many tips. What can you suggest us for short stays, fellowships in labs when the person is not working on exactly the same topic? Many times the technology is available. The technology available there is very interesting for the research, but the project should interest the hosting research group.
Well, I think any experience is good. I think if you are trying to convince the host to receive you, maybe you need to clarify what may your inputs be to the group, but also how you can, I insist in that, how you will improve your work. And many times you don't need to work just in your research topic. You need to interact, and this will open your mind and give you new views and new ideas. So you don't need to go exactly to a lab that is doing exactly what you have been trained for. You must shift a little bit, and surely I won't go to a physics lab, but I can go to another lab working on ecology, and maybe I can enrich myself with other points of view. Not only the available technology, it's more important the available ideas in that lab.
Okay, I think thank you to our senior scientists and panelists. They have been quite useful in demystifying how we need to market our areas from our PhD to postdoc and as future scientists.